Thank you for tuning in to another episode of In Range. We're coming to you today from Tombstone, Arizona, in front of a sign like this, no weapons beyond this point. Now, I'm in front of the magistrate court, and a sign like this in front of a courthouse really isn't an unusual thing. However, this type of gun control is not a new phenomenon. It goes all the way back into the Old West. All right, we're on the northern historic portion of what was the original Tombstone city block. And behind me are the Chiricahua Mountains, sometimes also referred to as Cochise Stronghold, because that was a stronghold of the Apache Indians who were still hostile and not necessarily all deposited in reservations at this point. Being in the rural areas around Tombstone was a risky endeavor, and that's exactly what the ranchers needed to do. Tombstone, like many other Old West towns, needed a lot of things around it to facilitate the normal lifestyle of the people that lived here. They needed lodging, they needed hotels, they needed saloons, they needed entertainment, they needed work, and these ranchers ranched around the area in the rural part to provide that beef and stock and other things necessary not only for the people that lived in towns like this, but also as their livelihood and to provide beef to the U.S. government under contracts. Being out in those rural areas was a risky endeavor. You were inherently more likely to be attacked by renegade Apaches or other dangerous activities, Mexican rustlers, or even other rustlers from the community around you. Therefore, having guns, whether long arms, pistols, or both, or being heavily armed, was a common practice of the people that lived in the rural area. You never knew what was going to come your way, and so therefore having a gun at your side was an important thing to preserve your life and your livelihood. The people that lived in the rural area were typically Democrats. The people that lived in the city were typically entrepreneurs and businessmen, and they were Republicans. The guys running the mines and owning the restaurants, typically Republicans. The guys growing the beef out in the field, typically Democrats. That doesn't sound like it would matter, but it actually culminates into some of what happened here with the gun control laws and ultimately what we're getting to. A subset of the ranching community that surrounded Tombstone to fulfill its needs was referred to as the Cowboy faction. Cowboy was spelled uniquely at that time, C-O-W-B-O-Y-S. You'll see that in the media of the time. That was not the dashing cowboy we think of in modern day. That was actually a slur. It was kind of a degenerate term. It was for people that were considered rustlers, general troublemakers. They were still important to the community of Tombstone. They needed what the cowboys brought to town, and sometimes they looked the other way if the meat was rustled and stolen, but they were still trouble in general. The Clantons and McClowleys were prominent ranchers in this area that had come from not only Texas but New Mexico and had formed ranches southwest and northeast of Tombstone to provide these needs, ostensibly as legitimate ranchers, but generally referred to in the Republican-controlled town as cowboys, and therefore trouble in general.
So in 1879, a guy named Wyatt Earp showed up in Tombstone. Who was this guy? We've seen a lot of movies about him, but the real Wyatt Earp maybe isn't quite what you'd picture. So Wyatt Earp had made a bit of a name for himself in Dodge City as a lawman. Wasn't famous. A lot of people think, well, he must have been famous. He wasn't really famous. Didn't do a perfect job. He kind of had an affinity for buffaloing people, which is hitting them over the head with a pistol butt. Got reprimanded for that on at least one occasion. But he decided to try and make a new start. And what he wanted to do was be an entrepreneur. As he put it, at the time in the census, he was a capitalist. So he came to Tombstone out on the frontier to make his fortune. That actually really didn't go quite as well as he'd planned. So he ended up instead working for the Wells Fargo company as a corporate, kind of a corporate mercenary in some ways. At the time, Wells Fargo had this interesting position as being a corporation that could kind of enforce its own will as law, and no one really said anything. He ended up getting into law enforcement here in Tombstone as well, not by being elected, but actually by being appointed as an assistant deputy sheriff. And at that point, he starts bringing his own style of law enforcement into Tombstone. And ultimately, in 1881, the city enacted City Ordinance Number 9, which was the beginning of gun control here in Tombstone. It was an ordinance which prohibited the carry or concealment of firearms in the hand or on the person. Well, not just firearms, but any deadly weapon. This was a significant change, especially for the rural community that, of course, had to come into Tombstone to do a lot of their business, to do their trading, to buy supplies, and to have regular entertainment and social experience. So for the cowboys outside of town, all of a sudden, some stranger comes in from back east in Kansas and wants to tell them where they can and can't carry, and they didn't take well to this. It was not popular. This continued an ongoing feud between what we know today and what was at the time also referred to as the Cowboy faction and the Earp faction, the Republicans and the Democrats. This would lead to a lot of trouble.
One of the problems with laws like Ordinance Number 9 was that it was subjectively enforced. And in fact, interpretation of it was subjective. It defined that you could carry guns coming into town, you could carry guns leaving town, you just couldn't carry them within city limits. However, who's to define leaving? Who's to define coming? It's up to the person that's enforcing the rule. And in fact, rules like that are enforced subjectively based on your relationship. Doc Holliday, for example, previous to this law being passed, had assaulted Milt Joyce, the owner of the Oriental Saloon, by bursting in, wildly firing a gun, hit Milt Joyce in the hand, hit a bystander in the hand, and Milt Joyce ultimately picked up a pistol and beat Doc Holliday almost to death. Doc Holliday was arrested for this, not charged with murder, not charged with attempted murder. He landed up pleading out as assault and battery with a $25 fine. If someone else had done that, probably would have gone a different way. I guess it's good to be friends with the local law enforcement. With that in mind, he later, after the law was passed, was known to be carrying a concealed pistol around town regularly. Around the Earps, his law enforcement friends, nothing done about it. Someone else is carrying a gun around town, they were literally beat about the back of the head with a pistol, gun taken away, and taken to court to be fined for their incursion against the powers that be. Now to put this in context, the Cowboys, they weren't choir boys. They definitely were trouble. They did rustle cattle, and Earp and others had issues with them in the past where they found stolen U.S. government mules on their property, for example. And so Earp and other law enforcement had a pretty negative perception of the Cowboys in general. However, that doesn't mean when they came in town that they were necessarily breaking a law, but they did definitely get harassed when they would come into town. Earp in general would find something to pick on them for. Their horses on the sidewalk, they would harass them for that, fine them for that. He would make sure they definitely didn't have a concealed weapon on them, even though other people that Earp was friends with did. Whatever they were doing, he was definitely there to cause them grief and trouble, and this engendered a lot of bad blood between both groups. Neither one was choir boys, but now there's a blood feud rising between them, mostly because of pedantic type police enforcement while in town. And if you were a cowboy coming into town, and believe me, you needed to come into town for resources, ammunition, food, accessories, supplies, you didn't want to do it because you know Earp or one of his cronies was there pretty much to give you grief.
The evening of October 25th, Ike Clanton has come into town in Tombstone and spending some money and having a good time. He's drinking, he's playing cards, he's actually playing cards with the Earps, among other people. But looks like he has a few too many. By the morning of the 26th, Ike Clanton's wandering around town with his pistol and his Winchester rifle. He's threatening to kill the first Earp he sees. Obviously, something's gotten him riled up, probably a little too drunk. You can't really wander around town threatening to kill the local sheriff. And so, Morgan and Virgil Earp see him, they come up behind him, pull out a pistol, and smack him over the back of the head with a pistol butt. The Buffalo. In an interesting display of how quickly the justice system worked at that time, they immediately pick him up, carry him to the courthouse, charge him, fine him, disarm him, and put him back out on the street, now unarmed. He pays a $25 fine for illegal carry of a pistol.
A number of the cowboy faction come into town hearing that Ike is stirring up trouble. They come here to pick him up. They're like, oh, this is going on again. They're seen around 2 o'clock in this building behind me, which was at that time Spangenberg's gun shop, purchasing ammunition. The McClarys and clans are gathered in an alley on Fremont Street, some of them with horses, probably getting ready to leave town, we don't know. However, locals tell the Earps, who are in a saloon on Allen Street, that they're gathered down there heavily armed. Previously, earlier in the day in the courthouse, Wyatt told Ike, "You've threatened my life a knife, you've got a fight coming." And Ike pretty much said, "Bring it on." The Earps decide this is their opportunity to enforce Ordinance number 9, selectively enforced, randomly enforced, depending on who you are. They're going to use this misdemeanor as their chance. They deputize Doc Holliday, a known criminal. We know this already. They walk line abreast down to this alley on Fremont Street. 2:30 in the afternoon, 3 men are dead.
So the legacy of the Earp statute, as it was sometimes called, lasted a lot longer than you might expect. This law was actually on the books, in effect here in Tombstone, until 1994, believe it or not. You know, contrary to most people's belief, what most people expect, life here in a town in the Old West like Tombstone was actually remarkably safe. Far safer than it would have been in one of the major metropolitan areas, like Chicago, like it still is today. Of course, crime here in Tombstone, ever since the repeal of the carry ordinance, hasn't increased. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoy this sort of content. If you do, please consider checking out our Patreon page. It's what allows us to keep doing this sort of content here for you guys. Of course, if not, we understand. Check out the videos on YouTube and on Full 30. Subscribe and tell your friends.